I was actually a couple days ago. I was like, yeah, let's punt on this week because I was like, the kids are out of school. They're the Celtics and Bruins are out of it. There's really not going to be much to talk about. What are we going to do? Like talk about Stephon Diggs for the 40th time? And then a lot of stuff happened. We're going to try to touch on as much as we can, but the main thing and kind of the fulcrum of this entire episode is going to be the Red Sox trading Rafael Devers. And a lot has been talked about the trade itself. I do just want to kind of get that out of the way, but for anyone who's kind of tired of hearing the last 3 days of what prognosticators think of this trade, I really want to dig in today on the narrative around it, the ways that the Red Sox either did or did not kind of control that narrative. Maybe draw some contrasts and comparisons with another New England slash Boston based team, which I think has done a much better job of controlling that narrative in the last couple months. But I guess kind of like off the bat, I'll just kind of get this out of the way and get your guys' thoughts. Keegan, if you want to start, I know you had some strong feelings about this trade itself. What were your thoughts and reactions of it?
Yeah, I think even before we get into the narrative part of it, when you trade a top 10 hitter, maybe in baseball, but at least in the American League, and your best hitter, you need to get back surplus in the future. It doesn't need to be right now. It doesn't need to be immediately your team is better, but the future of your team should look a lot brighter. They didn't do that. Obviously, Jordan Hicks, he's going to be a reliever. He'll probably be here until his contract runs out at the conclusion of next season. And if they want to re sign him or whatever, but it's clear the experiment of him as a starting pitcher did not work. I don't think anybody wants to pay that guy $15 million to be a really volatile reliever in the back end of their bullpen. So I think that aspect of it out. Kyle Harrison might be a stud. He might be a number 5 pitcher. You have zero idea. It's all whether or not he can develop a second pitch because he's got a great fastball, something that the Red Sox seem to convince all of their starting pitchers not to throw for a while before the pitchers tell them to get bent and then they start throwing them again. So we'll see how that works out. And then James Tibbs is another outfielder. You already have a surplus there. And then Jose Bayo is like great. If he turns into something, that's awesome. He might not ever reach the majors, and that'll be okay too, I guess. So in the return itself, it's like you got one maybe really good player and a bunch of stuff to just fill in the gaps. And I think that's pretty gross considering the fact that Rafael Devers should be the starting designated hitter in the American League All Star team. So just overall, stinky trade. Really bad decision by the Red Sox.
Yeah, I mean, I can hold space for the fact that there was a necessity for them to probably get out from the Devers deal before things got worse and he got untradeable. At the same time, I think this whole thing was an unforced error that represents an organizational failure. And to me, I think Breslow's more on the hook for this than Devers is. A lot of people have been taking the comments Devers has made since he's gone to the Giants and said that he's willing to work out at first base as him sticking it to the Red Sox or being petty or whatever. My contention this entire time has been if they told him in October, get ready at third base, but you have specifically said you want us to add talent. We are going to add talent. It might come in the form of a third baseman. Lest we forget, they weren't just single-handedly focused on Alex Bregman. They were after Nolan Arenado, too. They were actively looking at third base options. I think if they addressed this head on months ago, we avoid this situation in large part. Ultimately, yeah, Devers has gotten paid. I wish he acquiesced. He should have acquiesced, but it never should have gotten to this point. And I think that's more on Breslow than it is on Devers. So to me, it's like, all right, great. Like, yeah, Jordan Hicks can be, Joe Kelly 2.0 who can't hack it as a starter, but you just let him throw 103 out of the bullpen and it's whatever. But it's like, you're essentially salary dumping one of the best hitters in the game. And I get that contract was going to be underwater in probably like 3 to 5 years, but they were also nuking his value by only letting him DH. And that was something, Ben, that's a drum I've beaten this entire time. Is I don't get why they tell guys to put their gloves away. And so, Breslow was the one who kind of cornered himself into this. So I'm not going to say that, even if they signed Bregman and been very forthright with Devers, that it would have gone over well. But I am as close to certain as could be without actually knowing that this would have gone much, much differently. And so for that, it's a huge failure.
I know that people are sick about hearing about Mookie Betts at this point, but I'll never stop talking about it because I think it's very convenient and helpful of the Red Sox to commit the second biggest personnel crime of their existence after winning a World Series in a year that ends in an 18. Because I think 50 years from now is going to be really helpful because the Yankees can start chanting 2018 the same way they chanted 1918 for 85 years. Everything goes back to the Mookie trade, and the Devers thing is just the latest domino to fall as a result of that. When you commit an error of that magnitude, and I realize that there's a lot of, people want to kind of cope and say, well, Mookie wasn't happy here. He wasn't going to be back. If you have a player of that caliber, a generational player, you find a way to make him happy. And with all due respect to Bogarts and Devers, I don't think they are generational players. They were very, very good players, exceptional players in their time. But the list of players who you remember generations after they're done playing is very small. Mookie is one of those players. Rafael Devers is not one of those players. Rafael Devers is a Ryan Sandberg. He is a Jeff Bagwell. Like a very good player, potentially a Hall of Fame level player, not one of the players that, you talk about 10 years, 20 years after there is like, some of the all-time greats. Mookie is in that rarefied air. And when you make the malpractice of letting a player like that go, you're now grasping at straws for the rest of your existence. And you get to the point, okay, you have the defensible move of letting Bogarts go because he's on the decline. Okay, so you got to do that. Then you reach the point, it's like, okay, well, we got to bring Devers back. He exhibits the least professionalism of those three players. He might be the best hitter, but he's the least kind of versatile in that way. The options were either mediocre third baseman or designated hitter. And now you get to the point where in a vacuum, this trade, I don't hate it. I think they wanted to get out from under that money. I think that they weren't doing him any service, just like he was doing them no service. But they kind of got to this point by the sunk cost of the Mookie deal, and they're still going to be living for that for years when it comes up with, Anthony and Marcelo Meyer and all these guys. They're still going to have kind of the specter of Mookie hanging over them until they have that next generational player, and hopefully it's one of these young guys.
I will. This is obviously. Go ahead, Keith. So this is obviously easy to say in hindsight, but I remember the discussion around the winter of 2019 into 2020 was like, they can't pay all these guys. They can't keep them all forever. And these contracts are going to be terrible and they're going to be awful for decades if they sign these guys. Looking at how the last few years have unfolded for Mookie Betts and Xander Bogaerts, since they went I would take a few bad years of Mookie Betts, or even a bad back end of a Xander Bogaerts contract at this point, because you probably think that the last 5 years go considerably differently. And it's so they're going to get stuck in this cycle for years and years and years because I don't know, we're trying to strip their top end talent to be better on the margins. Who knows? So that to me is they kind of hose themselves, and we have enough data at this point to be blowing up a 108 win team 2 years later in the interest of getting under a luxury tax threshold. They would be a more profitable brand if they had spent money and just kept building off of that instead of tearing it all down. So maybe one day they'll pay the piper for it, but it was, you're right, Ben. They are constantly going to be chasing this mistake like they did in a much shorter scale after they let John Lester walk. They ended up getting David Price. That didn't really pan out. They had to reach for Chris Sale, which at the time obviously made sense. But it's John Henry even admitted that they were pressing after letting Lester go. So we know that this is how they operate.
And from the money aspect too, the New York Yankees have albatross contracts at all times, constantly. 3 or 4 of them, really.
Right.
DJ LeMahieu should not be making $20 million a year or however much he's making, but He does, and he plays a bunch of different positions, and he fits wherever they need to kind of throw him to make the rest of it work. And I think the Red Sox, for a long time, did the same thing, and then they made a decision, somewhere around that Lester trade, I would say, where, or maybe even after that, when it was the 18 squad, and they didn't want to pay, Andrew Benintendi whatever he was gonna make. I don't know how much he's making right now, but it's probably too much, and they were right on that one. But if they would have just paid some of these guys, they could have then turned around and made the decisions on each one of them 2 to 3 years into these deals. And you trade the right ones away. You try to keep them. Like you said, Logan, the back end of a Mookie Betts contract probably isn't going to look great. He already has injury issues. He's already kind of been forced into a super utility role. Like, he's played center field, right field, shortstop, second base. He's probably pitched at points that I've missed. He's still Mookie Betts, but to make the contract worth what they're paying him, they've had to move him around, and he's had no problem doing it. So I think if you set the standard of this is what we do to keep this team competitive, we're going to pay these players, but we're also going to ask a lot of them. Maybe you wouldn't have the same issue that you had with Rafael Devers earlier this offseason, where he essentially threw a fit because you told him to throw the glove away. And that's another thing I was going to mention when Ben was talking about, he's either a DH or a third baseman. If you would have told him early in the offseason, we need you at first base potentially. Obviously the Tristan Casas injury changes things, but we might need you here because it might be what's best for the team. I would imagine he had no problem with that. It was, you're throwing your glove away and you're done. You're our DH. This is where you're going to be long term. Alex Cora said it publicly. And then after they found themselves in some hot water, they moved and they asked him to do it. And he said, you told me one thing and you lied. And then you told me another thing and now you're lying again. I'm not doing it. I think that's where the issue is. It's their whole, I'm going to make a promise and then I'm going to break it immediately thing that they've done for 15 years now, that really he made them pay for. And I have no problem with that, because I think looking at it from what they say on one side to what they say on the other, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, because this is the same team who says positional versatility is what we want. We want Romy Gonzalez to play all over the place and he can play against left-handed pitchers. And you're saying it with all of these other guys, but with Devers, you're telling him, stock, whatever, you're playing designated hitter. That's where you're going to be for long term. And then you're immediately turning around and trying to change that. That's where the issue comes in, is the mixed messaging from the Red Sox.
Rafael Devers is ultimately responsible for his own actions. However, he was put in the position to be the bad guy by their poor communication with everybody, not just him, but with Alex Cora, with the media, with the rest of the team, everybody. I said from the beginning, I have nothing against Craig Breslow. He is unqualified for this job. And the worst thing that happens when you are unqualified for a job and you realize you're unqualified for a job, he was not the first option. He was not the first choice. The worst thing that can happen is that you become kind of emotionally or egotistically vulnerable. That if a player challenges you in the media, then you lash out and say, well, I'm trading your ass. F around and find out. If an employee makes a remark against you in a Zoom call, you say, I'm the boss, you're out of here. It becomes something where, he doesn't know how to communicate. And that's not just like from reading, behind the scenes. It's like hearing the press conferences. Everything that he says is designed and trained to sound good to someone whose job is letters, someone who has CEO, CMO,
McKinsey people.
What's that?
McKinsey people.
Yeah, it all sounds good to that, except when you're a human and you hear that talking, you're like, none of this has any. Like, there's nothing in this sentence whatsoever. And, you look at the way that the people who are effective at it and how it changes and how you can get somebody, to do almost anything, if you just communicate it to them effectively. And I think that is like the really, really like kind of hard thing to hear. And Sam Kennedy, I think, is not immune to it as well. There are remarks in that press conference of them saying, with respect to, Mookie and Devers and Xander Bogaerts, I think, I would put our track record over these last 20 years against anybody with 4 world championships. I was like, where did those 4 world championships come from? They didn't just
We're 7 years
appear.
removed.
Well,
this has all also happened since the last championship.
That's a good point. But those players are who won you those championships. Right. Like, to be like, hey, with all due respect to those great players, we won. No, Sam, Craig. Yeah, well, Craig, you won one, but no, Sam, you didn't win anything. Those guys are the ones who won it, and to say our organization won those things, the organization just happened to be the umbrella under which those players won. And when they're expressing that opinion in a press conference, you can see why players might end up having resentment towards management.
No doubt. And I mean, I saw a post that I wholeheartedly agree with, that the look at our World Series since 2000 thing is quickly becoming look at all of our Yankees fans being look at all of our rings when they were alive for 2 of them. It's guys, we're now 7 years removed, and you've dumped all the players from the team and haven't done a goddamn thing since of any consequence besides getting 2 games short of a World Series out of nowhere, and then being bad on both sides of that. I think this whole process has really outlined the big concern about Craig Breslow coming into this was that he lacked feel. And it's there is, and it's bizarre that someone who played seems to be that difficult or challenged, in terms of being able to figure out how to get a message through to some of these guys, because it's, I was listening to his interview on WEI yesterday, and I had a coworker who's not a Red Sox fan also listened to it, and he messaged me and he goes, "This sounds like a hostage tape." And that's what it's like listening to Craig Breslow talk, where it's he talks himself in circles, and it's you can't tell if he's trying to be honest about something, or if he's trying to remember what Sam Kennedy told him he has to say, or if he has to try and remember that he needs to maintain leverage in some of these things. So it's I feel like his head has to be exploding with all the different voices that are in his head at this point. And it's just is he a figurehead? What's happening? Because I'm not big on the theory that, John Henry's pulling the strings and has all this day-to-day involvement, but I do think what ultimately happened was Breslow had a green light to dump him once Devers rebuffed Henry's, trip to Kansas City or whatever. But ultimately, as it relates to Breslow, I think some of this was kind of a vanity thing, to your point, Ben, about F around and find out. And I think that it didn't ultimately matter. As long as there is a package of some competence, I think Breslow is going to take it. And I think that was to, kind of draw his line in the sand, which I get, they're at where they're at. Don't double down on it. But at the same time, it's yeah, man, congrats on drawing a line in the sand for a problem that you created.
He's almost been on defense since day one. And it even goes back to, free agency. And the moves they made were all reactionary to what they initially wanted didn't work out. So it was shit. We got to, the Garrett Crochet trade happened 4 or 5 hours after Max Fried signed with the Yankees, and they were in on Fried. They didn't get him, and they essentially overpaid. Garrett Crochet is awesome. I think he's going to be great for a long time. They overpaid for Garrett Crochet because they knew they needed a starting pitcher. If they came out of the winter meetings without one, there was going to be a revolt. And it was the same thing with Bregman, where they waited for as long as possible, and then they finally, everybody showed up to spring training, and they were like, if we don't add a right-handed bat to this lineup, there's going to be a revolt. So they did that. So it's almost like he's felt he needs to be backed into a corner before he actually does anything. And whether that's the case or it's just worked out that way, that is not what I want the guy leading my baseball front office to be doing. I don't want him to constantly be defending himself and trying to prove that he's worthy of his job. And I think when you mentioned, Ben, that he wasn't the first choice, he was their probably third choice. I know they had a couple guys who had held the job at other places who rebuffed them, the Toronto GM, the Houston GM. So it's that mentality mixed with, I made a mistake and I'm not going to be willing to own up to it with the miscommunication with Devers until after the fact. He said in his, hour-long session with the media, maybe the communication on our part. I think about it every day. Maybe it wasn't right. And it's like, the fact that you aren't saying definitely we didn't communicate correctly with the face of the franchise, that's a problem in and of itself. And the big thing for me with Breslow is somebody who professionally can't let his eyes glaze over when these guys are doing the mumbo jumbo CEO speak. I even have a hard time because halfway through a press conference, I'll find myself be like, shit, I missed the last question because I went into my own headspace. So I wonder if when he's talking to players and to other people in that front office, if they're doing the same thing. And that guy who said, "Thanks, Brez, you effing stiff" on Zoom, he missed the last 3 minutes because he was in his own head talking about what the hell is this guy talking about? Thinks he closes it out, he doesn't, and then you end up losing your job because of it. Because you can't successfully communicate with a person who speaks like a CEO 24/7, 365.
Can we quickly poll on if that was a fireable offense? Because
No.
I don't think it was either.
No.
I think it obviously deserved to be reprimanded, but I don't know if I'd fire the guy.
I've said things to bosses that I think are much worse than that. And it was like, I think as a professional, you have to understand people get frustrated, and then you go back and have a conversation, and you could yell at somebody and say, "Don't disrespect me," whatever, blah, blah, blah. But in a professional environment and in a competitive environment, you work for the Boston Red Sox. This is a baseball organization. Sometimes you say things because you're upset, and you should be able to move past that. I think that makes Breslow come across like a stiff, to be honest with you. He proved his point.
I think it is, with the caveat though, because it was public, like it was on it wasn't like one-on-one, behind closed doors. But I will say with the caveat that, like, what do you think Theo and Larry Lucchino called each other? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the knockdown, drag out wars those guys had. It just seems like, I feel like Larry Lucchino's looking down like, wait, hold on. You fired that guy for that? Do you have any idea what Theo called me back in the day?
Yeah. Yeah, it is just bizarre because it's like you're right. Like he shouldn't have done it. Like I'm not endorsing that comment, but it's like, yeah, that seems like one of those things where it's like, hey, Breslow, if you want to draw, your line and go and like air that guy out in a conference room where everyone can see you're airing him out, like whatever, go for it, do it. But yeah, it does come across like a professional baseball environment by and large is not the same as a typical office environment. And like, I work in office environments that sound like the hold of a ship with the way people speak. And it's like, let's have some levels here. Like, yeah, people are going to say things in a baseball environment that they might not otherwise. And it's like, yeah, Breslow, you do kind of present yourself as a certain way if you're going to be ruling with this iron fist, supposedly, and then someone pushes back or makes a snide remark and you're, iron fist, I guess.
The fact that the guy's name has been printed and repeated multiple times reveals that he and the other people on that call think that Breslow was the one in the wrong. Because if the person who relayed that story to June, and I'm sure that June, reached out to that guy afterwards and said, hey, they would not have used the name and given the name, and the guy would not have given his okay to use his name if he thought he was going to be the one that looked bad in that situation. I'm sure it was a text from June like, hey, I saw this thing. Like, do you have any comment? No, thanks. Okay, but do you mind if I name him? Yeah, sure, go ahead. I don't care. I'm almost like positive it was some sort of interaction like that, and that tells you all you need to know that Carl Moshe or however you say his name. Quick thing for the budding journalists out there. If so, this is a reporting hack. If, like, let's say you're using a guy like that as your source, right? But you don't want it to be obvious that you used him as your source, mispronounce their name slightly. So like if I Logan, if I give you like some information about stuff that happened to me, like just you would go on your and be like, yeah, there's a Ben Watanabe who was reprimanded, and then right after that they're like, well, it couldn't have been Ben because he's mispronounced his name if you talked about it. So I'm also kind of curious if like that's how you actually say his name, but whatever.
Also, June in the original
you saw there was a
story,
typo.
Yeah, he
there
wrote
you
Craig,
go.
which is genius.
Yep,
Just
exactly.
genius work out of June.
Exactly.
Craig and Carl are close enough.
Galaxy brain.
Yeah.